No, I have a.
All right. Looks like it's on.
I got worried.
Go for it.
All right. My name is James C. Davis, and I'm going to talk to you about using TypeScript in your Ember applications and add-ons. Here's how to find me various places. So first, a little bit about me. I want to know about all of y'all too, but I only have so much time, so you find me later because I like meeting new people. So first of all, I'm a husband and father. There's my lovely wife and kids. Hi at home if you're watching this. I'll talk to you later. I got to do a presentation. So anyway, I also enjoy music, listening to and playing. I play a few different musical instruments. I'm an amateur genealogist and avid outdoorsman. Those things are awesome. I love doing them. None of them qualify me to talk about Ember and TypeScript. So my work, which doesn't define me, because that was about me. I am a senior software engineer and the front-end lead for the Center for Open Science based in Charlottesville, Virginia. And our main, and so it's a nonprofit technology company, and the mission for openness and replicability in scholarly research. And so our main product is something called the Open Science Framework. And it is a scholarly commons to connect the entire research cycle. It's kind of like project management software for academic research and sharing all of your work and all this kind of stuff. The front end is written in Ember. Well, most of it's in Ember. It's getting there. But also, it's, you guessed it, 100% TypeScript. So that's why I'm here. And it also happens to be 100% open source. So in my humble opinion, it's become a pretty good resource for figuring out how to do TypeScript in Ember. We love that we can put it out there, all of our code, and we do lots of crazy things in there and have lots of types and stuff. And so we put it out there for people to look at. And I didn't put a link in this presentation, did I? I will give you a link later if you want to go check that out. So our pain is your gain. Just kidding, but kind of, you know, it's been a road to do it. We started over a year ago doing TypeScript, and it's been evolving as we go. I'm also on what I don't know if it has an official name, the Typed Ember team. It's a group of us that co-maintain the Ember CLI TypeScript add-on, which makes it all possible. But it's more than that, really, because with just the add-on, you need more stuff, which the Ember and Ember data type definitions, which I'll talk a little bit later about what type definitions are, and kind of anything related to using TypeScript and types and Ember, and sort of coordinating that. So TypeScript. You've probably heard all the buzz about TypeScript. TypeScript. It's the best thing since sliced bread, right? It means no more runtime errors. It means you don't need tests. I actually heard this. People are claiming this. No. Here's the things I'm not going to talk about, any of that stuff. I'm not going to try to convince you that TypeScript is amazing, that you should use it for everything, that it'll solve all your problems, any of those things, because it won't. But it can do cool stuff, and it is useful. So just some background knowledge. So what's a type? Hey, since I have a small audience, I can give this an EmberConf, but anybody, what's a type? There's no wrong answer. Just any idea? Okay. So, so types are things like string is a type, or number, or Boolean. And JavaScript is pretty loosey-goosey, and through the magic of dynamic types and automatic typecasting, and you can kind of use those sort of interchangeably. Like you can say, is this string true? You know, or you know, this number, we'll just treat it like a string, and JavaScript lets you get away with that just fine, which is cool and is good, but not always what you want. So this is a good time to interject and tell you that, so TypeScript, it doesn't change the way JavaScript works. And that's because it can't, because you don't actually run TypeScript. At least not in the browser, at least not yet. Maybe one day. I think I saw the other day that they actually do have an implementation that will run TypeScript like natively, not in a browser, but like anyway, something like that. But for now, generally, TypeScript is a transpiled language. And even that, it's not, yeah, it's transpiled, but so, all right, so if you don't run it like in your browser, how is it useful? How does it do anything? So what it's doing is static code analysis. So pretty much like ESLint, kind of. It's kind of similar in a way. It's kind of like a linter. The main differences being, so where ESLint is enforcing consistent code style and best practices and all your opinions that are probably not other people's opinions and whatnot. TypeScript, through some special annotations, is enforcing type safety. So we'll talk a little bit about what that is. So I talked about these simple types like string, number, Boolean, and stuff. It gets more interesting once you get into objects and arrays, and functions and classes, because that's a thing now. So one way that I like to think about types, especially in TypeScript, is as a shape. So what I mean by a shape is a shape. Like, and this is where I need more code examples. Like, and I have some later, but this would be a good place for one. It's a rough draft. So in TypeScript, you could have, let's just say a POJO. Like, you have one called foo, and it has properties name and age. And you have one called bar, and it has properties name and age. In TypeScript, and name is a string and age is a number, let's say. In TypeScript, those two are the same. They are the same shape, so you can use them interchangeably, even though they are different objects. It doesn't care about instance of things. It just cares about what the shape of what they look like. That's probably the example I should use for that. So what TypeScript is really trying to do is not let you put a square peg in a round hole, because you could beat on it with that hammer, but you're probably going to break things. So that's what TypeScript is doing when I'm talking about type safety and enforcing types. Say, I need a thing that looks like this. You're passing a thing that looks like this. Can't do it. And it's not the exact thing, just something that looks like it. And then there's all sorts of magic that I don't have time to get into about where you can say, well, it kind of looks like this. There's things called partials, and yeah, but this is an overview talk. This is not a deep dive. So another thing, so documentation. Who likes documentation? Yeah, documentation is great. Who likes writing documentation? So TypeScript, when you have type annotations in TypeScript, you get pretty good auto-generated API documentation without having to go and put big doc blocks and say, these are all my parameters and this is what their types. It's just all kind of built in. And there's some pretty nice tools that will auto-generate this stuff for you from your types. Still name your variables and functions well and things, because it can't do magic, but it can figure out the types of things and function signatures and what should be passed. So another thing that it's good at is, anybody ever encountered this? So things like this, you can virtually eliminate with TypeScript. One of the nice things about TypeScript is there's various levels of strictness that you can turn on. So you can actually add it to your app, and you can say it's totally fine if nothing type checks, because you just say don't enforce that. And then you could turn that on, and there's something, it's called, yeah, strict null checks that would prevent this, which is where if you try to access something that could be undefined or null, has any chance of it, it'll stop you. So that's another nice thing that it can do. So what makes this possible in Ember is something called ember-CLI TypeScript. So ember-CLI TypeScript, hopefully by EmberConf, will have released officially version 2.0, which is completely different from version 1.0 because it's a major version. But it's completely different, mainly though just in the way that it works. So remember how earlier I was talking about how TypeScript is a transpiled or compiled language? Well, really, TypeScript is just JavaScript with types. And when I show you a picture of it, you see that in a minute. But it's really just JavaScript with types. And so with Babel 7, which is what ember-CLI TypeScript 2 uses, you just let Babel do the transpilation or converting of TypeScript to JavaScript, which it does not do type checking. It just rips out all the type annotations, and you're left with JavaScript. So that's great, but what if you want to do type checking? And so that's where ember-CLI TypeScript comes in, because it actually it uses, in version 2.0, it uses some express middleware to run the TypeScript compiler on your code to actually type check it during the build. But lets Babel do all the Babel things, which is very nice. So I'm going to go into a little bit of example. Anybody read this stuff? Mm-hmm. All right, so this is just an example of, so this add method here, we'll say it's in a service. Yeah, I think the service was called repo in this example. So right up here, oh, there's no pointer. Should bring a pointer in every account. Okay, up here where it says adders, you see this funny little colon to do, and then after the method it says to do. So what that is, those are type annotations. So those are saying this method takes something called adders, and the type of that is to do. And earlier in this file, there's an import statement that's importing this right here. So what this is, this type is defining a shape. I talked about shapes earlier. So this is saying to do is something that has a title, so it's an object, title is a string, and completed is a Boolean. And then it exports that. So we import it into here, and now we can use it. And so we define that. That's in the service called repo. Down here, this is, let's say, in some component code, that's an action. So right here, we call this add method on, this was this repo service here. And we pass it a thing, an object that has a title. That target, that value, that trim. I need a simpler example. These are something I stole, but that's a string. False is a Boolean. So that's going to type check here because it matches this shape. So what you get is it's impossible to pass invalid arguments to this add method, basically. And so that's where it's checking that, like I said, is at compile time. So in the build with, I think I have an example in just a minute. It'll do it on reload. So if you change it, it'll type check just that one file, reload. There's also pretty darn good editor support, especially if you use VS Code, because Microsoft and TypeScript. I'm a Vim user, and actually works really well in Vim. There's something called Ale that will talk to language servers, and TS server, which is the TypeScript language server. Makes it so that you actually can get really nice reporting right in your editor. So, if you got one of these wrong, if I thought completed was a string or a number, and I put that there, it'll actually stop and tell you. All right. So let's see. So this is just an example of, this was from an example app, and it shows you what happens with ember-cli TypeScript when you, there's a little GIF here. So yeah, this tries to access something that doesn't exist, and it gives you some, stops and gives you this property foo does not exist on type string, because value is a string right here. Value is this from component. In Ember-cli TypeScript 2, these type errors will actually be even nicer. I don't have a good example of that with me right now. So you'd like to use TypeScript in your app. So you're probably wondering, do I have to convert everything at once? Do I have to go all in? And the answer is no, you don't. You could start with one file anywhere. You're not going to get the full benefit of it, obviously, unless you convert more things to it. When we started on ours, we did it piece by piece, building it up. There's a bunch of different places you can start. Something I meant to say, I was planning on saying when I was talking about test about TypeScript, you don't need test, which is totally false. The TypeScript can help you. There's a certain class of tests that may not be as necessary with TypeScript, where you're just doing some basic like type checking type things, but I never really wrote those tests anyway. So I tend to focus more on like high level acceptance tests and stuff, and then drill down where we need to. But yeah, generally that's false. Like you need tests because TypeScript will not. You can still write bad code, error code. You can have plenty of bugs with TypeScript. But what it can do is help you write better tests, and that's sometimes like a really good place to start is in your tests, because what you can do in your test is, if they're typed and you're saying, I don't know, go grab this model of this type and do something with it, like it just makes them more robust. So then like if you change something, you don't even have to run the test sometimes to know if something's broke, because you have tests that are expecting certain properties on a model or something of certain types. And so if you change it, probably good to have some examples of that. There's more that I haven't gotten in here yet that I want to say like about stuff. I'm going to probably show after this a couple things in an actual app that will actually go into the presentation. But so apps. So but what about add-ons, you say? At least it's going to talk about the add-on ecosystem. So you can totally use TypeScript in add-ons. So how does that work? Because you want everybody to be able to use your add-on, not just people running TypeScript. So what you do there is you write the add-on in TypeScript. TypeScript has the ability to produce what are called definition files. So they're these d.ts. So what a definition file is basically all the shapes. It's saying here's all the shapes, and it can produce that and give you JavaScript and definition files to go along with it. And so here's your JavaScript that's been compiled out of TypeScript into JavaScript. Anybody can use it, JavaScript or TypeScript, but along with it are these definition files that have all the shapes that then an app written in TypeScript can consume. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. Their ember-cli TypeScript has some pre-published scripts and things that automate most of that for you, so that you can just write it in TypeScript, and then you're shipping these types. And so talking about documentation, so if you have these type definitions that are shipping with your add-on, then there's your API documentation. You can auto-generate it from your TypeScript files. It's a way people can go in and look at your type definitions without having to go look at all your gnarly code and actually just see what the shapes are. See, okay, here's this object or this class and has these methods on it, and you can pass these things to it, and this is what's valid there. So I'm going to end. I just had like a thank you slide, but it's not the end yet, because let me show you all a couple of things real quick that I didn't get into my app yet, if you'll bear with me. What I was going to do. I think I had. Yeah. So, you know what? I didn't talk about it all. Okay. I realized one of the problems when you give a talk on something that you use every single day is you forget that, like, what people don't know. So like, I'm gonna definitely have you guys like tell me all the things that like I've glossed over that you're like, I have no idea what's going on. So, but I'm just gonna talk about. I can't. Hold on. I need to mirror my screen. It was in presentation mode. 1 second. And move this bigger. Okay. What's up, bigger? I can do bigger. So there's actually several things that I'm gonna have to add myself more notes that I meant to say that I didn't say. So when I was talking about our pain is your gain and all that, and it being easy now, because Octane, because this is like the big right. So you got to get that. You got to get Octane in if you're going to speak at EmberConf this year. I think, yeah. So Octane, lots of.
Isn't it classes?
Yeah. That's the main reason. So you've been so classes. So obviously this is a service that's defined a little differently than you might not be used to if you haven't done native classes. So it's actually using an ES6 class, extending service instead of service.extend. So the one, I would even call it caveat, because really, so Ember is moving toward native classes being how you do things in Ember. Yay, finally. So to really get the full advantage of TypeScript, you need to use native classes, because here you're exporting a thing, a class. This class has a shape, and then if you inject that service somewhere, it can understand it very well. If you are not using classes, things don't work. I won't get into details, but it doesn't work that great, I guess. The other thing, and this is just kind of a thing with native classes in general, is decorators. So to use native classes everywhere and use them well, you have to use decorators. So slightly experimental. We're all sad that they didn't make stage 3, but they will next time, right? So that's probably I would say what's tripped people up the most, like so far, like in the channel, and when I've worked with people learning how to do TypeScript, is that like everything looks different because this is a native class and you have decorators and stuff. As that becomes more mainstream and just kind of the way we do Ember, then TypeScript is really just adding these little funny annotations, that are pretty straightforward, really. I think so. What else did I want to say? And so another interesting thing is that the tools around it have gotten much better. Just the tools around TypeScript, the ESLint plugins for TypeScript have gotten really, really good. We recently upgraded our app to the latest version of all those, and a bunch of things that we either had to do ESLint ignores because it didn't know what it was. It now says, oh, I know what that is now. Like special TypeScript-y things. It also started enforcing things that it wasn't enforcing before because, for example, this is not an example, but it didn't know what @computed meant. So any rules on computeds, like the brace expansion rule, I don't know if you're familiar with that, to say like if you have, let's say it was current user ID.foo and .bar and that. Yeah, it wasn't enforcing that at all, even though we had it turned on because it didn't know what it is. But it does now. So the story has gotten really good. Oh, wow. My computer just... anyways, so let me just open up questions now. So also, I'm still trying to figure out how to scope this talk, obviously, because it's a 30, I think they only have like 25 minutes, right? Like of actual talk time or something. Like it's pretty short. And so I'm trying to like scope it. I can't really teach people TypeScript, and I can't really teach them how to do Ember and TypeScript. There's a workshop for that. My friend Chris Grytro is running it. If you really want to do it, go to it. It's excellent. I took it last year. He's a very good teacher. Little pitch for him. So yeah, it's hard. Like there was like, I took like tons of notes, and when I was like, I'm gonna make this the presentation, I was like, this presentation is gonna be 3 hours long. Like, and so I was trying to dial it back, and I don't know. So was like what I've said here useful at all? Did it give you like kind of an overview? Like, so my goal is really like to kind of say, look, this is possible. Here's some of the tools you use to do it. Here's how you get started. I don't have things in here that I'm realizing now I should put as like where to get help, because there's lots of great places for help. There's a really good, small, but growing community around using TypeScript and Ember. The typed Ember team people are all really great, but then there's lots of other people that are very enthusiastic about it. And so Discord, the Ember, I think they called it Ember TypeScript instead of ember-cli TypeScript. It's Ember. The Ember TypeScript channel on Discord is a great place. So ember-cli TypeScript 2, we're going to have real docs, not just a README file, or random blog posts that get out of date really fast for everybody. We're actually going to set up ember-cli addon docs and do it for real. Part of it's been working out. We've been in close coordination with the learning team. I've been going to learning team meetings for, I think I've been to the last 6 of them, to try to be like, okay, how are you guys going to teach Octane and native classes and these things so that we can have our guides be appropriate? My analogy was, are we teaching a foreign language or just a dialect? Is it, because when you see some of this stuff, that can look pretty different from Ember, but if they're going to teach it that way, so we're still working that out a little bit. Hopefully by EmberConf, it'll all be polished and shiny and pretty, and I'll just be able to point to docs for that. I'll just be like, have our doc site and be like, this and this and this, and there you go. So anyway, I guess I'll wrap it up there and not go too long. Any questions or like anything from this or comments or? Oh, sure.
Yeah, I wanted to say you answered 2 questions that I had coming into this. If
I answered one, I feel like I did.
My first one, when I read the docs a few months ago for the add-on, it encourages you to kind of make the leap all at once, if I recall. And in our code base, that's with the size of XP.
It's impossible.
Yeah.
Sure.
So I backed away from it because of that, but I like that you mentioned you can do it incrementally.
You totally can.
You won't get all of the benefits, but there are still some benefits
Right.
pretty early on.
If you can type one model and one component that uses that model, then you've done something, and then you just build it out from there. That's yeah, definitely.
My other question was going to be, how does it interact with native classes?
Yeah.
I wasn't sure because we've just started using native classes in our product.
Cool.
And, it's
Cool.
exciting
Yeah.
to see that.
Yeah. Native classes are the shapes that we're passing around. So.
How does it affect the build stuff, like the hot reload? Does it slow down?
So right now, with Ember, the 1x versions, it does once. It's not terrible, but as the app gets big, it does start slowing it down, and that's because it's running the TypeScript compiler and then taking that and handing that to Babel, which is TypeScript compilers. It's pretty good, but it's not like super fast. With the 2.0 version that we're on like release candidate 7 or something at this point. Like we're about to release it, but we want to get the docs good and stuff too. It doesn't do that. It uses Babel, and so what's happening there with the Babel TypeScript plugin is it's just throwing away the type information. So it is just as fast, really. We've seen pretty major speed increases, and which I'm looking forward to because we have a fairly good size app that is getting bigger all the time. And so it's so that's the cool thing, that Babel can do it now, that you can do it nice and fast.
So you mentioned a cool portion where you can export like the specs and how the shapes look.
Yeah.
Like, this feels like it'd be really fast to prototype out. You have an API, you have to go through all the models and the scores. Like, can this take in, I don't know, maybe I export TypeScript from a backend. Like, this will help out a lot.
Yeah, let me show you some. There's some really cool things, and I don't know how long do we have for? Is it just?
I'd wrap it up.
Okay? I'll show you one cool thing really quick because I just think this is something that I think is really cool. So I was telling Robert earlier, we have an API that I would call JSON API-like because it has a lot of customizations, let's say, extensions, you might call them. So something I did was actually type out our API documents. And so you can actually, there's something called JSON API TypeScript, which are type definitions for JSON API documents. And then I took them and extended them. I started there, and I added like all our special stuff. Like we have pagination, so like we have stuff for paginated meta. Like we have lots of special stuff, right? And so what's really cool is then all our custom code that we have in our adapters and our serializers and one-off kind of stuff. We use these types that are based on the document that we're going to get, and it really helps. Like it makes it faster for doing that kind of stuff, and not just like, well, we think we're going to get this. And then the last thing I'm going to say that I'm not going to show you or get into. So does anybody use Mirage? Do you guys use Mirage? So we're typing Mirage and doing all our Mirage in TypeScript, and it's really cool. Because you can actually type check your Mirage factories against your Ember data models and your fixtures, and yeah, it's taken some work to figure it out, but our stuff is all open source and out there. And anyway, I'd love to talk to you guys more another time.
Thanks.
Lisa?
I need to do some editing in the other direction. All right, what am I moving into what? It's not gonna work.
I think you need a different
I don't think
adapter.
that's going to, but yeah.
Oh, she has HDMI on that side.
Well,
Yeah, you can.
Yeah, I could just do this.
Oh
right?
yeah, that'll maybe work. If that doesn't work, we have this. No, it's like, well,
Discord. Oh, it's telling me something over there. How do I get there? I don't want whatever that is. Maybe I did, whatever that was.
Slides.
What happens if I go? Hey, cool.
works.
I don't know if that's how you're supposed to get that. Do I stand for the?
You don't have to stand. You can do whatever you want.
I have to stand there. Here, can I be more informal?
Yeah, sure.
All right, so I'm going to make up and have all the extra code that he was going to put in there because I've got all the slides. So I am here to talk today about, it is officially called Anatomy of an Ember add-on ecosystem. Basically, add-ons that have their own system of plugins like ember-cli-deploy, ember-service-worker, that basically seem to magically solve a problem. So you just install something, install some plugins, tweak a config, and boom, something's done. So I recently started working on ember-service-worker, and when I found out I was going to be speaking about this, I thought that I envisioned this talk where it was kind of like walking through a nature hike, and like the secrets of nature reveal themselves to you. And I started digging into the code and figuring out how I was going to do it, and I realized that my talk really should be called Figuring Out an Add-on Ecosystem Line by Line with special help provided by Google. So I'm Lisa Backer. If you have not met me or I haven't met you, I'm a senior software engineer at Dockyard. I am a lifelong Muppet fan, which you will find out. And since this is local, you can see here. And like I said, I'm recent maintainer for ember-service-worker, but I've been doing web development for almost 20 years at this point. So I remember when open source was not a viable option for a lot of things, and we didn't have access to source code, and we had to just guess what was going on beyond the limits of our code. So I'm a big fan, and yes, I know that does make me feel really old to say all that. So starting to work with ember-service-worker, I wanted to see where an implementer would start, right, in the docs. So I go to the documentation, and it looks like it's pretty simple. Install something else, like I said, you know, maybe configure something at the end. Maybe I can click the button. There we go. And that's it. Congratulations, your app is now offline first. So these docs say it takes 30 minutes. I've got a demo that does it in 90 seconds. So here's just a generic super rentals sample application, right? Showing here that there's nothing installed yet. I'm going to install ember-service-worker. Don't worry, I sped this up. And then I'm going to install a plugin that is ember-service-worker index that caches your index HTML file. Then in another plugin caches your assets. Don't you wish it installed that fast? And then I'm going to serve. So when I refresh my page, I'll see I have a service worker now installed. You don't have to worry too much about service workers. That's not the point of the talk. You can see there's some things in there that look specific to super rentals. I've got caches, one for my assets, one for my index. The asset cache has assets. The index cache has an index. When I go up and refresh, cool things happen. You'll see that it comes from the service worker instead of from the network. And ta-da, hand wavy demo. So this is where a lot of people stop when they explain these kinds of things. They say, isn't this great? Go try it out. And you might, and it might work, and it might be great. But if you're trying to learn how to maintain the code, you need to go a little deeper. So I needed to study up some more. The way I like to approach these kinds of projects when I'm dealing with something that is maybe a little on my comfort level is to go to from the concepts first, then through the documentation, and then eventually start to dig into the code and figure it out from there. So that's what I'm going to do here. What is really a plugin? That's, I mean, we know the term, but how do people really using it here? So definitions on the web say a plugin is a bundle that adds functionality to an application called a host through some well-defined architecture for extensibility. I read kind of a cool thing on one of the Apple documentation sites that said, likened the host application, or in this case, the Ember add-on, to a giant infinite puzzle. And that all the pieces, all the plugins are like pieces in the puzzle. So if it has the right shape, then it can work in the puzzle and it can be part of that system. If it doesn't have the right shape, it doesn't implement the API, then it's not a valid plugin. So with these plugins, with these puzzle pieces, you can enable other developers to extend an application, support adding new features easily, reduce the size of your application when you're consuming it, because obviously you don't need to include all the plugins, just the ones you need. But the important thing here is that it allows customization by providing a well-defined API, or defined API. So then I had a obvious, probably, realization that an add-on is a plugin. A plugin is an add-on. These things are all the same. An Ember plugin is technically an add-on that is consuming or implementing the API defined by the add-on. Ember add-ons are implementing the API that's defined by Ember CLI hooks. All of these things, turtles all the way down. Maybe I shouldn't say that. So like I said, concepts, then docs. Configuration documents for Ember Service Worker show me that I can configure it with a couple of options. Versioning, it's when you blow away the cache, basically. Some, whether it's enabled or not, but also registration, which is how you register the service worker. And there's a couple different ways that it happens. One could be inline in the code, but the default is as a separate script call that gets included in the build. And I was particularly interested in how do you get this included in the build? How does this process work when you're dealing with these types of build level add-ons? So I started with the docs, went to the Ember CLI docs, which have been improved recently. And the learning team has been putting a lot of work into that. So that's great. Of course, when we get to working with build add-ons, it's kind of a little thin still. So I'm dealing still with the add-on API, which is not pretty, but it is auto-generated and therefore at least complete. And so as I mentioned, add-ons have their hooks. This is the well-defined API that we can implement through Ember. And I wanted to figure out, again, how to read a configuration file and include a file in the build based on a configuration setting. So a little searching through there got me to the included plugin, which says its uses can be including vendor files or setting configuration options. That sounds good. One of the tools I like to use when I'm trying to understand a new implementation of code, something I haven't looked at before, is to see how other people are doing it. And I was kind of shocked to realize that I'd never noticed this code search before in Ember Observer, but if you don't know it, it's really handy. It's in the main navigation. You can type in, it's only going to search the code of Ember addons, so you can type in whatever you're looking for. In this case, maybe the included hook. Sort it by score, so you can deal with the more established add-ons as your examples. Roll right into the code exactly where it is. So I found this to be very useful and maybe for a lot of other purposes as well. And here I see that this particular add-on is using this to read some options and include some vendor. It sounds kind of like what I'm trying to do. So I'm set. It's time to dive in. Here is a whole bunch of code. Don't worry about it yet. This is the included hook in Ember Service Worker. It does, there's a bunch of stuff at the top that's fingerprinting, so I'm going to get rid of that. And then we can start going through line by line. First, we're going to start by getting a reference to the options. The options are what we're passing in our configuration. And how do we know that they're the options? It's because our API docs tell us they are. When you create a new application, you pass in the defaults and the options. This is the boilerplate that's in your Ember CLI build file. So in here, I go to look for the Ember Service Worker. Why is it called that? It could be called that because it's the name of the add-on, but that's not actually why it's called that. It's called that because we told people to call it that in the documentation. And so this is what we're looking for. It makes sense to use the add-on name for namespace collisions, but I've definitely seen them named all sorts of things. So here now we've got the registration strategy that we were mentioning. We're setting some defaults. You notice in here, when you're dealing with things at build time, you can set defaults based on like what your environment is or different environment, system environment variables. And then we pull in that script that I was curious about. And we do an app import of vendor ember-service-worker load registration script. So let's see, where is this coming from? I know that the vendor folder is where we keep JavaScript and CSS assets and such that aren't managed by NPM. Thanks, guys. But so let's go see where that is. Here's our folder structure for ember-service-worker. There is no vendor directory in there. So searching the code, I find the only reference to this file is here in my tree for vendor. It writes out a file. So what is tree for vendor? Why is it writing files? I go to the docs and it says tree for vendor. Returns the tree for all vendor files. Yay. Okay, that clears it up. So I've done enough Ember at this point that I know if it says tree, it means broccoli, right? So I'll just go like search for broccoli. Here's your Google. Here's your Google slide. So when I search for broccoli trees, this is what I get. My favorite thing on this slide is it says, is broccoli real? People also ask. You can also scroll down and read all about the dangers of Instagram about this artistic broccoli tree. This is all fascinating. This is not what I'm looking for. I do remember that being to add in the broccoli.js website, documentation site. So I'll just pull it up from my browser history. Yeah, so that's gone for some reason right now. I'll do a side note that I've actually seen written in discourse that it is coming back, but at the moment it is not there. So what you can go to is a tutorial that came out of a pre-conference training last year called Eat Your Greens. And there's actually another one in pre-conference this year. So this guy's awesome if you had a chance to go. This tutorial is really helpful. I highly recommend it. It gives a lot of good information. It explains broccoli in a really accessible way. So in here, I'll figure out what's a broccoli tree. Well, there are no broccoli trees. They're called nodes. They changed the name a long time ago, but we still call it trees in Ember. It represents a set of files, right? So the files can be transformed by plugins. The plugins get an input of files, a node or a tree, and they do an export of a node or a tree. So inputs, the output from one can be the input to the next plugin. There's a build function on every plugin. This is kind of your well-defined API, right? And then Broccoli itself is the tool that handles putting it all together. In this tutorial, they also kind of use the tree concept to think more about the build as a whole, which is where this image comes up, where you start with your application at the top, do some chunking of files, get different types, run some transformations on them, and at the end, get your build. So back to the code we were looking at. In tree for vendor, what we're really doing is writing out a file that we're going to return in the vendor scoped tree, build tree. Now that it's there dynamically, when we're included, we can import it because we wrote it ourselves. We know it's there. All right, so now we can breathe for a second. We went through a bunch of code, went through some hooks. We learned about how to reconfig. We still don't know anything about like working with plugins. So we should do that. So I just did a search through the code, found a function called find plugins. I figure that's got to be a good place to start. So that's where we're going to start. It's in a hook called post-process tree. So we're going to go to the documentation. It says post-process tree, post-process a tree. So rather than digging too far into this, or getting too upset at documentation, because this is open source, I can crack open the code and figure this out at any time. I do at this point understand what a tree is, and we do at this point know, or hopefully know, that post is after. So we're going to assume this is after the tree has been processed and move on from there. So back to our find plugins. What that's actually doing is calling this filter by keyword utility function in there that looks for an ember-service-worker plugin keyword. That's just the keywords that are set up in package.json. So it's very straightforward. It's also the beginning of how ember-cli-deploy does it and some other systems. All right, so now we can get a reference to them. How do we interact with them? We've got something called a service worker builder. This is kind of unique to Ember Service Worker, but it is setting up the background for what we need to build the trees for service worker and service worker registration, we're passing it all of our plugins that we previously identified. And I'm gonna come back to that, but I just want to show that we then call build on it for each type of thing we're trying to build. So it's a Broccoli plugin-esque class. Now I know we're going really deep into Ember Service Worker at this point now, but I promise we're going to talk about plugins only, mostly. So here's the Service Worker Builder class. It's got a lot of stuff in it. We're going to look at just some of it. That build function that is more of the Broccoli plugin style build, what it's doing, it's calling in to generate trees, Broccoli trees or nodes for all the plugins first. That's just a wrapper function really to loop through all the plugins and call tree for plugin on each one. So let's go there. In here, we're calling it with one plugin and for the type, the service worker or the service worker registration. So to simplify, let's just pretend we called it for service worker. First thing we're going to do here is get a reference to the path within our plugin with a /service worker directory. So we're kind of defining an API for how our plugins can work with us. Create a service worker directory in your code, put an index.js file, and we'll put it into the build, right? So here's a little bit of that. And then we also have a method that we're mentioning that's tree for service worker. Sounds suspiciously like tree for vendor and maybe all these other tree for functions that are out there. This is a hook that's been created by Ember Service Worker to let the plugins interact. So this is, again, part of the well-defined API of this ecosystem. So we're going to go through and check for that path that I showed you in another plugin there. If it exists, go ahead and generate a Broccoli tree from it. And if we have our API hook method, go ahead and call it with that tree. Return the outputs. That's your new tree. And then at the end, we return that using a funnel to put it into a namespace path. And a funnel is just a Broccoli plugin that will allow you to move files around, maybe do a subset of files. We're just using it to move things here. So that was getting our trees for plugin. We're still back in our build function here. The next thing we're going to do is compile them. Once again, simplifying that weird, thing to just say, let's assume we called it with type service worker. So we're going to call this with SW.js. So we're compiling our trees with an entry point tree name, SW.js. So in the compile trees, we take an entry point. What's an entry point? Oh my God, are you going to show me more code? Yes, I'm going to show you more code. Here's the entry point, the entire class. In this case, this one really does extend Broccoli plugin. This is a legit Broccoli plugin. It's got a constructor. All you got to worry about there is it's passing all the plugin nodes that we were working with before, and it's setting a value of an entry point name. The entry point JavaScript is going to go through each of the plugins that you've passed in your tree, look for a specific file within them, that index.js file. If it's there, it's going to generate out an import statement. All we're really doing is creating an entry point JavaScript here. It's just a bunch of imports for each one of your plugins so that you have a reference to them and you have that code available at runtime. And then writing out that file. So back in our compile trees, we've got that import file. We're going to put it together with our plugins. So now we have an import for our code and we've got our actual code. We're using Broccoli merge trees. So again, I had to go Google and find out what that was, and that merges trees. Thanks again for these great definitions. But in this case, there is not a whole lot of other ways to explain it. Finally, at the end, we call some transformations of our own. Babel, which has been mentioned tonight a bunch already. So some transpilation there, that's a word. Roll up to handle dealing with dependencies, and minification. So that's all of that comes back out into our service worker tree or service worker registration tree, because we called it twice. And we do a little more service worker magic, and then at the end we return it all with our application. So now we have a build that includes the service worker specific stuff, all of its plugin specific stuff, anything that was included in the hooks can all be included here. All right, take a little break. Let's just mention what those libraries were that I glossed over. Babel, like ember-service-worker and ember-cli-deploy, doesn't really do anything on its own. It works all with plugins. It's another ecosystem of plugins. Most in this case to do transpilation of code to make your code backwards compatible. Rollup also works as with a ecosystem of plugins to deal with your dependencies. And along the way, it is smart enough to see what code you actually need and what code you don't. So that's what's called tree shaking, what everybody gets excited about lately. Like I said, and that is also made up of plugins. All right, so finally we have all this. We have all our crazy code. What about testing? I pop open ember-service-worker and I look in the test directory, and I don't see anything I expect to see. And I'm starting to realize this isn't like testing a regular Ember application, or even like add-ons that I've worked with in the past. This is really testing the build of an application. Which means we're testing in Node. And at the time that this was written, which is no longer true, I don't think, meant Mocha. So once again, out of my element. But at least I understand enough about tests of what we should be testing for, right? We should have unit tests for our core functionality or some sort of appropriately named test type. The host or application, or in this case, the ember-service-worker core add-on, needs to test that it's calling its API where it is expected to be called, that it is appropriately handling it when the plugin doesn't implement the API or doesn't implement it right. Plugins need to test that they're actually implementing the required hooks at least. And both need to test the build output, that what you're actually getting what you expect at the end of the day, right? So how do we test that build output? We're dealing with Broccoli builds. So let's go to the Broccoli world. There's a Broccoli test helper package here that really does make testing the inputs and outputs pretty simple. Very short codes this time. We require a Broccoli test helper, and we get a reference to a thing called a create builder. This is a little helper function. So let's say we have a test that says it's going to transpile some code. I'm going to mock up some plugins here. They're not important. But I'm going to make an instance of my service worker builder and pass it those mocked up plugins. And then I'm going to wrap the whole thing in this helper create builder. And this is going to give me almost like a decorated thing, in that I can call build on this now instead of calling build on my core functionality. When I do that, I'm going to get back a basically mocked output from my mocked input. So I can set up what I expect to see, read the files, and assert that they're there, right? Assert that SW.js was created, assert that its contents are what I expected. So it's a pretty simple way of testing build input output. So what we learned, plugin architecture is just a fancy way of talking about what we already know. Ember add-ons implement a plugin architecture via hooks. Broccoli implements the plugin architecture. So does Babel and Rollup. None of these are scary. It's usually more complicated than a hand-wavy demo makes it look, but none of it is scary. And we can take advantage of these to write our own ecosystems for whatever you need to do in your own Ember applications or add-ons. Finally, a note on reading the source. So like I said at the beginning, open source development is very interesting to me because I can actually dig in and find out what's going on. If something's broken, I can fix it, or if at least it seems broken to me, I can suggest what I think it should be. And it's really great when the documentation is perfect, and it's really great when the maintainer is there and can answer your questions at 3 a.m. on Discord. But that's not always going to work out. So rolling up your sleeves and jumping into the source code really doesn't have to be that scary. And once you realize that you actually are starting to get it, can be kind of rewarding. So that's it. That's me everywhere, Eshta, DC. I get that done in 22, but I talk super fast.
It was pretty fast, yeah.
Because there's like 80 slides.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah, if anybody has any questions, I'm going to do that here. We're not allowed to at EmberConf, but yeah.
So you have to transpile the code in add-on. I thought the Ember, like the app, would handle it.
This is just transpiling what's done at the very end. So it's not transpiling the full application, and it's not even, and it's actually one of the questions that I have for Martin, the original maintainer on this, is why we're doing it in a post-process hook, and why can't we do something earlier and take away some of those steps? But I guarantee you there's a reason that I just haven't figured out yet. But since I am pulling in code at that point that's directly being pulled in from ES6 code, then I am going to have to transpile it. Like I'm reading their index.js file.
Yeah,
From the
plugin.
From the plugin.
Right, right.
So,
So
you know, I
that's
guess
pulling
my-
it in after the whole build has been processed.
so
Probably
you-
to make sure it's already included or available.
Yeah, no. So I guess my question is, why doesn't the Ember app itself handle it? Like, why do you have to call transpile in? Your-
I'm in the post-process hook at that point. So I'm after Ember's done its thing.
So just because
That
it's a
makes
service
sense.
worker, right? And a service worker is like not part of an Ember app, really. So.
Well, yeah, but you would think that if you called in, did all this mumbo jumbo with the plugins earlier in the
I
process,
mean, it doesn't have to be the objective.
that it could just go and get transpiled and everything on the end. That wasn't the decision made by whoever would.
We have a weird thing in ember-cli-deploy where we actually have to manually transpile in repo add-ons.
Uh-huh.
Because-
Yeah, in our application, that's the side point I was gonna bring up. Yeah, the same thing.
Yes.
It's yes next or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. But we don't do that in 2.0 because we let that will handle it all. So if it can. Yeah. But I don't know, it does seem like that we should put it in inject.
Yeah, well, I've the first few months of working on this, just trying to understand it. And so next I will start to improve or respond to all the people that have been asking me questions in the last 2 months. Is that like so much code that you wanted to kill yourself, or was that okay?
It's okay. Yeah, it's good.
I like the way you kind of showed the whole thing, but then blanked out chunks of it and kind of showed you the steps.
Yeah.
That was really helpful.
What are you using to do that? Is that some software that like?
Are you kidding? This
Or
is,
is it all-
look at this.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. I didn't know if there was some cool thing. there.
Yeah, no, it's literally like me. And I'm
Yeah,
sure there is a
that's
better way to
right.
do this.
Like,
This
I
is,
made it look like it was.
I know,
that's,
I was
yeah,
like-
I don't know. I know that there's gotta be like something that I'm missing here that would make that all one slide and you just hit next, 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 but it's like 20 in a row and then a Kermit. And then like,
Do the Kermits help you see like where it's really the next slide?
it does. And it's also meant to be like just a break from staring at the white
Sure.
and because everyone needs more Kermit.
I do like the dark text on a white background because I think I always code black
I
background.
code black, yeah.
Yeah, but you can't do that on a projector because then everyone's like,
Yeah.
Well, I will end this then.